The blood pooling in her boot told Elara Pendleton she had about 10 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died on this God-forsaken stretch of Texas prairie. She had been riding hard from Fort Worth when her horse stepped in a gopher hole and went down screaming, taking her with it in a tangle of leather and bone that ended with her right arm bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch. The horse had bolted once it regained its footing, leaving her alone under the punishing August sun of 1878 with nothing but sagebrush and silence for company. Elara pressed her back against a sun-bleached rock and forced herself to breathe through the white-hot agony radiating from her forearm. She was 3 hours from town, maybe more on foot, and the sun was already climbing toward its merciless noon position. No one knew where she had gone. Her father was 2 weeks dead from influenza, her mother 5 years before that, and the ranch hands she had inherited along with the struggling cattle operation had quit within days of learning a 22-year-old woman would be giving them orders. She had been riding out to check the north pasture fence line when the accident happened. Driven by the stubborn pride that had kept her from selling the land her father had worked himself into an early grave to maintain, the bone had broken clean through. She could see the white edge of it pressing against the skin of her forearm, threatening to tear through. If that happened, if the bone punctured the skin and the wound got infected out here in the dirt and heat, she would die slowly and in agony. Even if she managed to walk back to town, even if she somehow made it through the blistering heat without water, a compound fracture meant almost certain blood poisoning. She had seen it happen to a ranch hand when she was 15. The screaming had lasted 3 days before he finally slipped into a fever dream and stopped waking up. Her hands shook as she unbuckled her belt and pulled it free from her waist. She had to set the bone herself. It was impossible, ridiculous, the kind of thing no reasonable person would even attempt, but the alternative was dying out here for the buzzards to find. She thought about her father, about how he used to say that Pendletons were too stubborn to know when they were beaten. She thought about her mother, who had pulled a breech calf with her bare hands and saved both the cow and the calf when every man on the ranch said it was hopeless. She looped the belt around a jutting piece of rock and gripped it between her teeth, biting down hard. Then she took hold of her own wrist with her left hand and pulled. The world went white with pain. She heard a scream that must have come from her own throat, muffled by the leather belt, and then a wet grinding sensation as the bone edges scraped against each other. Tears poured down her face, mixing with the sweat already soaking her collar. She pulled harder, straightening the arm, feeling for the moment when the bones would align. Her vision tunneled and sparkled at the edges. She was going to pass out. She was going to fail and die right here with her arm still broken, and no one would ever know she had tried. The bone slipped back into place with a sensation that was somehow worse than the break itself. Elara spat out the belt and vomited into the dirt beside her, her whole body shaking with shock and exertion. For a long moment, she simply sat there gasping, cradling her arm against her chest. Then, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knows they are walking a razor's edge, she tore strips from her petticoat and used them to bind 2 flat pieces of deadwood to her forearm. The makeshift splint was crude but solid. It would hold if she was careful. Standing up took 3 attempts. The world spun and tilted, and her legs felt like they were made of water, but she managed to get her boots under her and stay upright. Fort Worth was southeast. She knew that much. She picked out a landmark on the horizon, a distinctive outcropping of red rock, and started walking. The heat was devastating. Within an hour her lips were cracked and her tongue felt thick in her mouth. She had no hat, having lost it in the fall, and the sun beat down on her dark hair until she felt like her skull was cooking from the inside out. The pain in her arm had settled into a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Every step jarred it, sent fresh waves of agony up to her shoulder, but she kept moving because stopping meant dying. By the second hour, she was talking to herself, rambling streams of consciousness about her father's ranch, about the cattle that needed moving before winter, about the fence posts that needed replacing. It helped keep her mind off the pain and the thirst. Her throat was so dry now that the words came out as barely more than croaks. She did not hear the horse until it was almost on top of her. The sound of hoofbeats filtered through the haze of heat and exhaustion, and she turned to see a rider approaching from the west, coming fast. She tried to call out, but her voice failed her. All she managed was a hoarse whisper that would not have carried more than a few feet. She waved her good arm instead, a desperate flailing gesture that nearly overbalanced her. The rider saw her and changed course, closing the distance in seconds. He pulled up his horse in a spray of dust and was out of the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. Elara had a confused impression of broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, and pale blue eyes that looked almost startling in a face tanned the color of old leather. He caught her as her knees buckled, taking her weight easily. "Easy now," he said, and his voice was rough but gentle, with the slow drawl of someone who had spent his whole life in Texas. "I have got you." He lowered her into the shade of his horse and pulled a canteen from his saddle. The first sip of water was so painful on her parched throat that she gasped, but the second was like a blessing from God himself. He let her drink slowly, controlling the flow so she would not make herself sick. "Name is Quinn Bryant," he said. "I am trailing a stray calf and saw you from the ridge." "What in the hell are you doing out here?" Elara tried to answer but coughed instead. He waited patiently while she got her breathing under control, one large hand resting lightly on her shoulder to steady her. When she finally managed to speak, her voice sounded like old paper tearing. "Horse threw me, broke my arm." Quinn's eyes dropped to the makeshift splint, and she saw something change in his expression. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements, and gently examined her handiwork. His hands were surprisingly careful for their size, calloused but deft. He checked the alignment of the splint, tested the tightness of her cloth bindings, and then looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You set this yourself," she nodded, not trusting her voice. He sat back on his heels and stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, and a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It transformed his face, taking years off him. She realized he was younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than 30. "Lady, you are tougher than any man I have ever met, and I have ridden with some hard cases." Something warm bloomed in Elara's chest at those words, something that had nothing to do with the heat. She tried to return his smile, but her cracked lips split and started bleeding. Quinn made a concerned sound and dug in his saddlebag for a tin of salve. "Let me get you back to town," he said, dabbing the ointment onto her lips with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough cowboy exterior. "You need a real doctor to look at that arm." "Cannot afford a doctor," Elara rasped. "Just take me to my ranch. It is the old Pendleton place north of Fort Worth." "I know it," Quinn said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Your father was Matthew Pendleton. You knew him, bought cattle from him a few times." "He was a fair man. Heard he passed recently." "My condolences." Elara nodded, her throat tight. Quinn seemed to understand that she did not want to talk about it because he did not press. Instead, he helped her to her feet and got her into his saddle, then swung up behind her. She was too exhausted to feel self-conscious about the impropriety of sitting pressed against a strange man's chest. He wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her and took up the reins with the other, and they started back toward Fort Worth at an easy walk that would not jar her arm too badly. The relief of being in the saddle, of having water and shade from the sun provided by Quinn's body behind her, was so profound that Elara felt tears prick at her eyes. She had been so certain she was going to die out there. The odds had been stacked so heavily against her that survival had seemed like nothing more than a fantasy. But here she was, alive because she had been too stubborn to quit and lucky enough to be found by someone who cared enough to help. "Thank you," she whispered. She felt rather than saw Quinn's nod. Anyone would have done the same. "Not true," Elara said, thinking of the ranch hands who had abandoned her, of the neighbors who had made clear they thought a woman had no business trying to run a cattle operation. "Not everyone." They rode in silence for a while, the horse's steady gait lulling her into a state somewhere between waking and sleeping. The pain in her arm was still present but distant now, muffled by exhaustion and relief. She let her head rest against Quinn's shoulder and felt his arm tighten slightly around her waist, a gesture of protection that made her feel safer than she had in months. "How long were you out there?" Quinn asked after a time. 3 hours, maybe 4. Lost track. She heard him exhale slowly. "You are lucky you did not die of heat stroke. August in Texas is nothing to take lightly." "I know," Elara said. "I grew up here, but the fence line needed checking and I have no hands to do it. Everyone quit after Father died, said they would not take orders from a girl." There was a pause, and then Quinn said carefully, "Running a ranch alone is dangerous work, even for someone as tough as you apparently are. I do not have a choice. It is my land. My father worked himself to death for it, and I am not going to let it go without a fight." "Fair enough," Quinn said, and she appreciated that he did not argue with her or try to tell her what she should do. "But maybe you could use some help, at least until that arm heals." Elara turned her head slightly to look at him. "Are you offering?" Quinn met her eyes, and something electric passed between them in that moment. It was not just gratitude or relief or the strange intimacy of shared crisis. It was something deeper, a recognition that made her pulse quicken despite her exhaustion. "I might be," he said. "I am between jobs at the moment. Was working a drive up to Kansas, but the herd got sold off earlier than expected. I am not looking to settle down permanent anywhere, but a few weeks' work would suit me fine." "I cannot pay much," Elara warned. "The ranch is barely breaking even. Food and a place to sleep would be payment enough. I will work for that and maybe a small wage when you can afford it." It was an absurdly generous offer, the kind that made Elara suspicious despite her desperate need for help. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." Quinn was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was thoughtful. "I watched you set your own broken arm rather than give up and die. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. And I remember your father as a good man who treated his workers fair. Figure his daughter deserves a chance to make the ranch work if that is what she wants." Elara felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of fear and loneliness that had been there since her father died. She was not alone anymore. At least for a few weeks, she would have help. "All right," she said. "You have got yourself a job, Mr. Bryant." "Quinn," he corrected. "If we are going to be working together, you should call me Quinn." "Elara," she offered in return. "Elara Pendleton. Pleased to meet you, Elara, even if the circumstances could have been better." She surprised herself by laughing, a hoarse croak that hurt her raw throat but felt good anyway. "I have had worse days, believe it or not." "I believe it," Quinn said with a smile she could hear in his voice. "Something tells me you have seen your share of hard times." They reached the Pendleton ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The house was a modest 2-story structure built from local timber, weathered by wind and sun, until it had taken on the same dusty color as the landscape around it. The barn was larger than the house, sturdy and well-maintained, with a corral attached that currently held only 2 horses. Elara felt a pang of sadness looking at it. There had been a time when her father kept 24 horses and twice that many head of cattle. Now the operation had dwindled to almost nothing. Quinn helped her down from the saddle, supporting her weight when her legs proved unreliable. He got her into the house and settled in a chair at the kitchen table, then went back out to tend to his horse. Elara sat in the gathering dusk and tried to come to terms with everything that had happened. This morning she had been alone and terrified of losing everything. Now she had a broken arm but also an unexpected ally. Life moved in strange directions sometimes. Quinn came back in carrying his saddlebags and bedroll. He set them by the door and looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of someone who knows how to take stock of a situation. "You have got coffee," cupboard by the stove. He found the coffee and got a pot brewing, moving around the kitchen with the confidence of a man who has spent plenty of time cooking for himself on the trail. While the coffee heated, he rummaged through the pantry and came up with beans, bacon, and cornmeal. Within 20 minutes, he had a simple but substantial meal laid out on the table. Elara ate ravenously despite the ache in her arm. She had not realized how hungry she was until the smell of food hit her. Quinn ate with the same single-minded focus, and neither of them spoke until the plates were clean. "That was good," Elara said, pushing her plate away. "Thank you. Basic trail cooking is about all I am good for," Quinn said, pouring them both more coffee, "but it will keep you fed." He leaned back in his chair and regarded her seriously. "That arm needs proper tending. You did a remarkable job setting it, but those splints need to be checked, and you should probably have stitches where the skin tore. Is there a doctor in Fort Worth you trust?" "Dr. Brennan," Elara said. "He treated Father before he died, but like I said, I cannot afford to pay him right now." "I can cover it," Quinn said, raising a hand to forestall her protest. "Call it an advance on the wages you will owe me. We can settle up later." Elara wanted to argue, but the throbbing in her arm had intensified now that she was sitting still, and she knew he was right. She needed proper medical care or risk infection and complications that would cost far more than a doctor's visit. "All right," she said. "We will go tomorrow." "We will go now," Quinn corrected gently. "That arm has been set for hours without proper care. The sooner we get it looked at, the better." He was right, of course, but the thought of climbing back on a horse made Elara want to weep. Quinn must have seen it in her face because his expression softened. "I will hitch up the wagon if you have got one. You can lie down in the back and rest." They did have a wagon, an old flatbed her father had used for hauling supplies. Quinn found it in the barn and hitched up one of the horses, moving with the easy competence of someone who has done such tasks 1,000 times before. He helped Elara into the wagon bed and made her as comfortable as possible with blankets and feed sacks for cushioning, then climbed up on the driver's seat and got them moving toward Fort Worth. The trip took 2 hours in the dark, following the rutted road by moonlight. Elara drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in her arm keeping her from falling into real sleep. She was dimly aware of Quinn's presence on the driver's seat, a solid and reassuring shadow, and once when she cried out in pain, she heard him speaking to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her they were almost there, that she was going to be fine. Fort Worth at night was a collection of amber lights spilling from windows and the occasional lantern swinging on a porch. Quinn drove straight through the main street to a neat white house on the edge of town. He jumped down from the wagon and hammered on the door until a gray-haired man in a nightshirt opened it, looking irritated, until he saw Elara in the wagon bed. Dr. Brennan took charge with the brisk efficiency of a man who has dealt with emergencies for 40 years. He got Elara inside and onto his examination table, cut away her makeshift splint, and spent several minutes examining the break while making noncommittal humming sounds. "Whoever set this knew what they were doing," he said finally. "The alignment is near perfect. You are lucky you had someone with medical experience nearby." "She said it herself," Quinn said from where he stood by the door. Dr. Brennan looked up sharply, his bushy eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Herself, Quinn confirmed. "I found her walking back from the north pasture with it already splinted." The doctor turned to stare at Elara with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and respect. "Young lady, I have been practicing medicine for longer than you have been alive, and I can count on one hand the number of people I have met with the fortitude to set their own broken bone. The pain alone would incapacitate most folks." "It hurt," Elara said, which felt like a vast understatement. "But I did not have much choice." Dr. Brennan shook his head slowly, then turned his attention back to her arm. He cleaned the wound where the bone had stressed the skin, applied a foul-smelling ointment that made her eyes water, and then put on a proper splint made of shaped wood and wrapped with clean linen bandages. The whole process took the better part of an hour and left Elara sweating and shaking from the pain, but when it was done, her arm felt infinitely more secure. "You will need to keep that immobilized for at least 6 weeks, the doctor said, washing his hands in a basin. "Come back in 2 weeks so I can check on the healing. If you are very lucky and there is no infection, you will regain full use of the arm. But you need to rest it, Miss Pendleton. No ranch work, no heavy lifting. If you stress that break before it is fully healed, you will be dealing with consequences for the rest of your life." "I understand," Elara said, though the thought of 6 weeks of forced idleness made her want to scream. How was she supposed to keep the ranch running if she could not work? Quinn stepped forward and handed Dr. Brennan several bills. The doctor counted them, nodded, and tucked them into his pocket. Then he fixed Elara with a stern look. "I mean it about the rest. I know you have been running that ranch alone since your father passed, and I know you Pendletons are stubborn as mules, but you need to let that arm heal properly. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," Elara said meekly. Quinn helped her back out to the wagon, moving slowly and carefully to avoid jarring her arm. Once she was settled, he climbed up on the driver's seat and got them moving back toward the ranch. The motion of the wagon and the lateness of the hour conspired to pull Elara down into real sleep this time, and she did not wake until they were back at the ranch, and Quinn was lifting her out of the wagon bed. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "I know you can," Quinn said. "But you do not have to." He carried her into the house and up the stairs to what had been her parents' bedroom. Elara had been sleeping there since her father died, unable to bear the emptiness of the house otherwise. Quinn set her gently on the bed and pulled the blankets up over her. "Get some rest," he said. "I will be downstairs if you need anything." "You should take Father's old room," Elara said, fighting to keep her eyes open. "Down the hall, second door on the right. The bed is made up." "Appreciate it," Quinn said. He paused in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the lamp he carried. "You did good today, Elara. Real good. Not many people could have survived what you went through." She wanted to respond, wanted to thank him again for everything he had done, but sleep dragged her under before she could form the words. When Elara woke, pale morning light was filtering through the curtains, and someone was moving around downstairs. For a confused moment, she thought it was her father, that the last few months had been a nightmare, and she would go downstairs to find him making coffee and complaining about his aching back. Then the pain in her arm reasserted itself, and memory came flooding back. She made her way carefully downstairs, favoring her injured arm. Quinn was in the kitchen scrambling eggs in a cast iron pan, already dressed for the day. He looked up when she came in and smiled. "Morning. How are you feeling?" "Like I broke my arm and said it myself," Elara said, but she returned his smile. "Thank you for everything you did yesterday. I would have died out there without you." "You would have found a way to survive," Quinn said with conviction. "You are not the type to quit." He dished up eggs and bacon onto 2 plates, and they ate together in the morning quiet. It felt strange and comfortable at the same time, having someone else in the house. Elara had gotten used to the silence, to the echo of her own footsteps in the empty rooms. Having Quinn there made the place feel more alive. After breakfast, Quinn put on his hat and headed out to assess the ranch. Elara tried to follow, but he stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Doctor said rest. That means rest." "I can at least show you around," Elara protested. "You can tell me what needs doing, and I will go do it. No point in you walking around in this heat with a busted arm." It went against every instinct. Elara had to sit idle while someone else worked, but she forced herself to nod. Quinn pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil stub from his pocket and took notes while she explained the layout of the ranch, the condition of the fences, the water sources, and the cattle. Most of the herd had been sold off to pay debts after her father died, but there were still about 40 head scattered across the north pasture. "That is enough to rebuild from if we can keep them healthy through the winter," Quinn said thoughtfully. "The fence line needs work, though." "I will start on that today." He was as good as his word. Elara spent the morning resting in the shade of the porch, her arm propped on a pillow, watching Quinn work in the distance. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire with practiced efficiency. It was soothing somehow, watching him work. It made her feel less alone. By noon, the heat was oppressive. Quinn came back to the house for water and a brief rest, his shirt soaked through with sweat. Elara had managed to make sandwiches one-handed, and they ate together on the porch where there was at least the hope of a breeze. "You have got good land here," Quinn said, looking out over the property. "With some work and a bit of luck, you could build this place back up." "That is the plan," Elara said. "Father always believed in this land. He used to say it was hard country but honest country, that it would give you back what you put into it." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was," Elara said softly. "He was also stubborn and proud, and he worked too hard for too long. I think the ranch killed him in the end. The worry and the work just wore him down until there was nothing left." Quinn was quiet for a moment, then said, "Is that why you are so determined to keep it?" "To honor his memory," Elara considered the question. "Partly, but also because it is mine. The only thing in this world that belongs to me. If I let it go, what do I have? A woman alone with no family, no money, no prospects. At least with the ranch I have a chance." "You could marry," Quinn pointed out carefully. "Plenty of men would be happy to take on a woman with land." "And take the land right out from under me," Elara said with more bitterness than she intended. "I have had 3 proposals since Father died. Every one of them was more interested in the property than in me. I am not going to hand over everything my father worked for just so I can have the privilege of cooking and cleaning for some man who sees me as an inconvenience." Quinn nodded slowly. "Fair enough. A woman has a right to choose her own path, even if the world does not always see it that way." It was such an unexpected response, so different from the lectures about propriety and feminine roles that Elara had endured from well-meaning neighbors, that she found herself staring at him. Quinn caught her look and grinned. "What? You think because I am a cowboy I cannot have progressive opinions?" "It is unusual," Elara admitted. My mother raised me and my 3 sisters after my father died in the war, Quinn said. She ran a boarding house in San Antonio and did not take grief from anyone. She taught us that being born male or female does not determine what you are capable of, only what the world expects of you. And she taught us that expectations can be defied. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Quinn said, and the past tense told Elara all she needed to know. Died about 5 years back. Influenza, same as your father. They sat in companionable silence for a while, united by shared loss and the bone-deep understanding that comes from surviving hardship. Then Quinn rose and stretched, working out the kinks in his back. Better get back to it. Those fences will not fix themselves. He worked through the afternoon while Elara dozed fitfully in the heat, her arm throbbing with a dull ache that the laudanum Dr. Brennan had given her could only partly suppress. By evening, Quinn had finished a substantial section of fence line and come back to the house looking utterly exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a routine. Quinn worked from dawn until dark, repairing fences, tending the cattle, fixing the 100 small things that had gone neglected since Matthew Pendleton's death. Elara helped as much as she could one-handed, cooking meals and managing the household accounts, and planning for the work that would need to be done before winter. But more than the work, they talked. In the evenings after supper, sitting on the porch while the heat of the day slowly bled away, they shared stories about their lives. Quinn told her about growing up in San Antonio, about the years he spent learning the cattle trade, about the drives he had worked from Texas to Kansas, and all the wild country in between. Elara told him about her childhood on the ranch, about her mother's death when she was 17, about the slow decline of her father's health and the desperate struggle to keep the ranch afloat. The more time they spent together, the more Elara found herself drawn to Quinn. It was not just gratitude for his help, though she was profoundly grateful. It was something deeper, a connection that seemed to grow stronger with each conversation. She found herself watching for him during the day, listening for the sound of his boots on the porch. At night, she lay awake thinking about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle strength of his hands, the sound of his laugh. She told herself it was foolish. Quinn had made clear he was not looking to settle down. He would stay until her arm healed, and then he would move on, following the work wherever it took him. Getting attached would only lead to heartbreak, but her heart seemed determined not to listen to reason. Quinn, for his part, seemed equally drawn to her. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch. When he helped her with tasks that required 2 hands, his touch lingered longer than strictly necessary. There was a tension building between them, a charge in the air like the moments before a summer storm breaks. It came to a head on an evening 2 weeks after Quinn had found her in the desert. They had been to see Dr. Brennan that afternoon, and the doctor had pronounced himself pleased with how the break was healing. Elara's arm was still in the splint and would be for several more weeks, but there was no sign of infection and the bone was knitting properly. "You are fortunate," the doctor had told her, "and you have whoever set that break to thank. If it had been misaligned, you would be looking at a much longer recovery and possible permanent damage." Quinn had walked her back to the wagon with his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that sent shivers up her spine despite the heat. The ride back to the ranch had been quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Now they sat on the porch as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, painting the western sky in shades of fire. Quinn had been uncharacteristically quiet all evening, and Elara could sense something weighing on him. "What is it?" she asked finally. "You have been brooding all afternoon." Quinn looked at her, and the intensity in his blue eyes made her heart skip. "I should probably move on soon. Your arm is healing well, and you have learned what needs doing to keep the ranch running. You do not really need me here anymore." The words hit Elara like a physical blow. She had known this moment was coming, had tried to prepare herself for it, but hearing him say it out loud made her realize how completely unprepared she actually was. "Oh," she managed. "I suppose that makes sense." "Does it?" Quinn asked quietly. "Because I have been telling myself that for days now, and it does not feel like it makes sense at all." Lara's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Quinn stood up and paced to the edge of the porch, his back to her. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I came here planning to help you for a few weeks and then move on. That is what I do. I work a job, collect my pay, and drift to the next place. No attachments, no complications. It has suited me fine for years." He turned to face her, and the raw vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. "But then I got to know you, Elara. I watched you refuse to give up on this ranch even though everyone told you it was hopeless. I saw your strength and your stubbornness and your kindness. And somewhere along the way I stopped thinking about moving on and started thinking about staying." Elara stood up on shaking legs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Quinn, let me finish," he said, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He took her good hand in both of his touch warm and gentle. "I know I have got no right to say this. I am just a drifter with nothing to offer except a strong back and a willingness to work. You deserve better than that. But I am falling in love with you, Elara Pendleton. Have been since the day I watched you walk across that desert with your arm broken and your head held high. And if there is any chance you might feel the same way, I would like to stay. Not for a few weeks, but for good." Elara could not speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she reached up with her good hand and cupped Quinn's face, feeling the rasp of stubble under her palm. Then she pulled him down and kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then Quinn's arms came around her, careful of her injured arm, and he deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched her own. Elara felt like she was flying and drowning at the same time, overwhelmed by the intensity of her feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I will take that as a yes," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Yes," Elara confirmed, her voice shaking with emotion. "Yes to everything. I love you too, Quinn. I have been trying not to because I thought you would leave, but I cannot help it. You make me feel less alone. You make me feel like I can handle whatever comes next." "We can handle it," Quinn corrected. "Together." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the moment. When they finally went inside, Quinn kept his arm around her waist, as if he could not bear to let her go. They stayed up talking late into the night, making plans for the ranch, for their future. It felt surreal and wonderful and terrifying all at once. The next morning, Quinn rode into Fort Worth and came back with the circuit preacher, a jovial man named Reverend Thomas, who was happy to perform a simple wedding ceremony in the Pendleton ranch house parlor. There were no guests except for Dr. Brennan, who Quinn had insisted on inviting as witness. The doctor came bearing a bottle of good whiskey and his best wishes. "I have married hundreds of couples in my years as a preacher," Reverend Thomas said after the brief ceremony concluded, "but I have rarely seen 2 people look at each other the way you 2 do. You have got something special. Hold on to it." "We will," Quinn promised, his hand clasped tightly in Elara's. After the preacher and the doctor left, Quinn swept Elara into his arms and carried her up the stairs, both of them laughing like children. He set her gently on the bed and kissed her with a reverence that made her feel cherished beyond measure. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, suddenly nervous. "Tying yourself to a broken-down ranch and a woman with one good arm." "I am sure about you," Quinn said firmly. "The ranch is just land. You are everything." They made love slowly and carefully, Quinn ever mindful of her injured arm. Afterward, lying wrapped in each other's arms in the gathering darkness, Elara felt more at peace than she had in years. For so long she had been alone, carrying the weight of her father's legacy and her own survival on her shoulders. Now she had a partner, someone who saw her as an equal and loved her for her strength rather than despite it. The weeks turned into months. Elara's arm healed slowly but surely, and by October she was able to start working the ranch again, though Quinn insisted she take it easy and not push herself too hard. Together they worked to rebuild what had been lost, buying new cattle with the small savings Elara had managed to preserve and slowly expanding the herd. It was hard work, the kind that left them both exhausted at the end of each day, but it was satisfying too. Word spread through Fort Worth that the Pendleton Ranch was back in business, now run by the tough young woman who had set her own broken arm and the cowboy who had been smart enough to marry her. Some folks were skeptical that the operation would last, but Quinn and Elara proved them wrong through sheer determination and hard work. By the following spring, the ranch was showing a modest profit. They hired 2 hands to help with the work, young men who were willing to take orders from a woman and treated Elara with the respect she deserved. The cattle were healthy and multiplying, and the land that Matthew Pendleton had loved so much was thriving again. In July, Elara discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn one evening after supper, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and terror. He responded by picking her up and spinning her around, whooping with delight, then carefully setting her down and apologizing for being so rough. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "You are going to be a mother." "And you are going to be a father," Elara said, wiping away happy tears. "Are you ready for that, with you?" "I am ready for anything." Their son was born the following March on a sunny morning that felt like a promise of good things to come. The labor was long and difficult, but Elara faced it with the same stubborn determination she brought to everything else in her life. Quinn stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement until finally the baby arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect. They named him Matthew, after Elara's father. Little Matt had his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and from the start he showed signs of having inherited the stubborn Pendleton temperament. Quinn was a natural father, patient and loving, and Elara found herself falling even more deeply in love with him as she watched him with their son. The ranch continued to prosper. By the time Matt was 2, they had expanded their operation significantly and paid off the last of the debts Matthew Pendleton had left behind. They bought adjoining land when it came available, growing their holdings bit by bit. Elara proved to have a head for business as well as ranching, and Quinn was happy to let her handle the books and negotiations while he focused on the physical work. When Matt was 4, they had a daughter. Sarah came into the world during a thunderstorm, arriving so quickly that Dr. Brennan barely made it to the ranch in time. She was small and fierce and had her father's smile, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny finger from day one. The years rolled on, bringing both challenges and triumphs. There were droughts that tested their resources and winters that were harder than expected. There were cattle that got sick and horses that went lame and 100 other small disasters that are part of ranch life. But Quinn and Elara faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. On their 10th anniversary, Quinn took Elara back to the spot where he had found her that blazing August day, the place where her horse had thrown her, and she had set her own arm. They rode out together in the early morning before the heat became oppressive, and stood looking at the sun-bleached rock where she had pressed her back while she worked up the courage to do the impossible. "You ever think about that day?" Quinn asked, his arm around her waist. "Sometimes," Elara admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago now, like it happened to a different person." "In some ways it did," Quinn said. "You were alone then, desperate and scared even if you were too tough to show it." "I was terrified," Elara confessed. "I thought I was going to die out here. And then you came riding over that ridge like something out of a dream, and everything changed." Quinn pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "You saved yourself that day, Elara. You did the impossible because giving up was not in your nature." "I was just lucky enough to find you after." "We found each other," Elara corrected. "And thank God we did." They stood together in the morning quiet, remembering and grateful. Then they climbed back on their horses and rode home to the ranch, to their children and their life together. By the time Matt was 16 and Sarah 12, the Pendleton Bryant Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the Fort Worth area. They ran several hundred head of cattle and employed a dozen hands year-round. The original house had been expanded and improved, with a proper second-story addition and a wide wraparound porch where the family gathered in the evenings. Matt was already showing signs of being a fine rancher, with his mother's business sense and his father's way with horses. Sarah was more interested in books than cattle, and Elara encouraged her daughter's education, determined that Sarah would have choices she herself had never been given. One evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset with Quinn's hand clasped in hers, Elara reflected on how far they had come from that desperate day in the desert. She thought about the woman she had been then, alone and terrified but too stubborn to quit. She thought about the man who had found her and seen past the dirt and sweat and blood to the person underneath. And she thought about the life they had built together, piece by piece, through hard work and determination and love. "What are you thinking about?" Quinn asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Everything," Elara said. "How different my life would be if you had not come along when you did, how close I came to losing everything." "But you did not lose it," Quinn reminded her. "You saved yourself and then you let me help you save the ranch. That takes courage." "Letting you help was the scariest part," Elara admitted. "I had gotten so used to being alone, to relying only on myself. Trusting someone else felt impossible." "But you did it anyway," Quinn said. "Just like you set your own arm even though it seemed impossible. That is who you are, Elara. You do impossible things." She turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner and lover and best friend for more than a decade. There was silver in his dark hair now, and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to her, he was as handsome as the day he had ridden out of the heat shimmer to save her life. "We did impossible things," she corrected. "Together." Quinn leaned over and kissed her, soft and sweet. "Together," he agreed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Matt and Sarah came out to join them on the porch. They all sat together in the gathering twilight, talking and laughing, secure in the knowledge that they belonged to each other and to this land. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Quinn and Elara lay together in the darkness of their bedroom. Quinn's arm was draped across her waist, and Elara could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the wandering life to settle down here?" Quinn was silent for a moment, and then he pulled her closer. "Not for a single second. I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was a place to belong. You gave me that. You and the kids in this ranch. This is home. You are home." Elara felt tears prick at her eyes. Even after all these years, Quinn could still make her feel cherished with just a few words. She turned in his arms so she could face him, and in the moonlight filtering through the window she could see the love shining in his eyes. "I love you," she said. "I loved you from that first day, even though I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, but it was more than that. It was recognition, like my soul knew you before my mind did." "I felt it too," Quinn confessed. "The moment I saw you walking across that desert with your arm broken and your head held high, I thought, there goes the toughest person I have ever seen, and the most beautiful." I was done for right then. They made love slowly and gently, a reaffirmation of all the years they had spent together and all the years still to come. Afterward, drifting toward sleep in the warm darkness, Elara thought about destiny and chance. If her horse had not stepped in that gopher hole, if she had not survived long enough to set her own arm, if Quinn had been riding a different direction that day, their lives would have unfolded completely differently. But it had happened exactly the way it was meant to happen. She had survived because she was too stubborn to die, and Quinn had found her because he was the kind of man who would always stop to help someone in need. And from that desperate beginning, they had built something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to pass in the way they do, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. Matt married a neighboring rancher's daughter and brought her to live on the ranch, where she and Elara became fast friends. Sarah went away to school in the East, studying literature and writing letters home that were full of excitement about all she was learning. She eventually came back to Fort Worth and became a teacher, dedicating herself to educating the children of ranch families who might not otherwise have access to books and learning. Quinn and Elara became grandparents when Matt and his wife had twin boys. Watching Quinn with his grandsons, teaching them to ride and rope and work cattle, Elara was reminded of how lucky she was to have found a man who was not only a good husband, but a wonderful father and grandfather as well. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Matt and his family, Sarah and the schoolteacher she had married, Dr. Brennan, who was now elderly but still sharp as a tack, and half the town of Fort Worth, who had come to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. There were speeches and toasts, and at one point Reverend Thomas, who had married them all those years ago, stood up to address the crowd. "When I married Quinn and Elara," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "I told them they had something special. I have watched them over the years, and I stand by those words. They have built not just a successful ranch, but a partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and love. They have raised fine children and contributed to this community in countless ways. But most importantly, they have shown us all what is possible when two people commit to facing life's challenges together." The crowd applauded, and Elara felt Quinn's hand tighten around hers. She looked up at him and saw the same emotion reflected in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. Later, after the guests had gone home and the family had retired for the night, Quinn and Elara walked out to the barn together. It was a clear night, the stars brilliant overhead, and the air was finally cooling after the heat of the day. 25 years, Quinn said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you in the desert. Other times it feels like you have been part of my life forever." "Both," Elara said. "It feels like both to me too." They stood in the barn doorway, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to build up. In the distance, cattle moved slowly across the pasture. The fences were strong and straight, the buildings well maintained, everything bearing the mark of years of careful stewardship. "Your father would be proud," Quinn said quietly, "of what you have done with this place." Of the life you have built. We built, Elara corrected, as she always did. I could not have done any of this without you. We make a good team, Quinn agreed. He pulled her into his arms and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The best team. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms under the stars. Elara thought about the terrified young woman she had been, alone in the desert with a broken arm and no hope. She thought about the courage it had taken to do what needed to be done, to save herself when no one else could. And she thought about the courage it had taken to trust Quinn, to let him into her life and her heart. Both kinds of courage had been necessary. The strength to stand alone and the strength to stand together. She had needed both to survive, to thrive, to build the life she now had. "Thank you," she said softly. Quinn pulled back slightly to look down at her. "For what?" "For seeing me," Elara said. "For seeing past the dirt and the blood and the broken arm to the person underneath. For loving me not despite my strength but because of it. For being my partner in every sense of the word." Quinn's eyes were bright with emotion. "Elara, you are the finest person I have ever known. Strong and brave and stubborn and kind. Loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done." He kissed her then, sweet and tender, and Elara felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt on their wedding night 25 years ago. Some things never changed, and that was exactly how she wanted it. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Elara looked up at the stars and sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided Quinn to her that blazing August day. She had been prepared to die alone in the desert, but instead she had found love and partnership and a life richer than she had ever imagined possible. The ranch continued to thrive as the years went on. Matt proved to be as skilled a rancher as his parents, and he gradually took on more responsibility for the day-to-day operations. His sons grew into capable young men who loved the land as much as their father and grandparents did. Sarah's work as a teacher made a real difference in the community, giving children opportunities they might not otherwise have had. Quinn and Elara settled into a comfortable semi-retirement, still involved in the ranch, but letting the younger generation take the lead. They spent their days working in the garden Elara had always wanted but never had time for, taking long rides across the land just to enjoy the beauty of it, and spoiling their grandchildren shamelessly. On a warm spring morning 30 years after Quinn had found Elara in the desert, they rode out together to the spot where it had all begun. It had become a sort of pilgrimage they made every few years, a way of remembering and honoring the moment that had changed both their lives. They sat on their horses side by side, looking at the sun-bleached rock that had been Elara's backrest while she set her own arm. The landscape had not changed much over the decades. Texas prairie was eternal in its own way, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. "I still cannot believe you did it," Quinn said, as he always did when they came here. "Set your own broken arm out here in the middle of nowhere with nothing but scraps of petticoat and dead wood. I still cannot believe you stopped to help a strange woman in the desert instead of just riding on about your business," Elara countered, as she always did. Quinn grinned at her, the same boyish grin that had made her heart skip 30 years ago. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Elara corrected. "The best decision was staying." "Fair point," Quinn conceded. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own memories. Then Elara spoke, her voice thoughtful. "You know what I have been thinking about lately? All those people who told me I could not run the ranch alone. All the neighbors who said a woman had no business trying to manage a cattle operation. Some of them never did change their minds, even after we proved them wrong." "Does that bother you?" Quinn asked. Elara considered the question. "Not anymore. It did at first when I was younger and angrier, But now I realize their opinions never mattered. What mattered was that I knew I could do it and you believed in me and together we made it work. That is enough. More than enough, Quinn agreed. You built something remarkable, Elara. Not just the ranch, but our whole life, our family. You gave our children and grandchildren a legacy of strength and determination. That matters more than what some closed-minded fool thinks about women ranchers. Elara reached across the space between their horses and took Quinn's hand. His palm was rough with calluses earned from a lifetime of hard work, and his grip was still strong despite his age. They were both getting older, gray-haired and slower than they used to be, but the connection between them was as strong as ever. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you from that first day, and I will love you until my last day, whenever that comes." Quinn brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And I love you. Always have, always will." They rode back to the ranch in the golden light of late morning, following the familiar trail that had been worn smooth by decades of passing. When they arrived, Matt was waiting on the porch with news that one of the mares had foaled overnight, a beautiful filly with legs that seemed too long for her body. Elara and Quinn went to the barn to admire the new arrival, standing at the stall door watching the wobbly-legged foal nurse from her mother. The cycle of life continued, generation after generation, each building on what came before. That evening, the whole family gathered for supper as they did every Sunday. The table was crowded with Matt and his wife and their boys, Sarah and her husband, and the various grandchildren who ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers. The conversation was loud and chaotic and wonderful, full of laughter and friendly arguments and the comfortable warmth of people who love each other. After the meal, while the younger generation cleaned up, Quinn and Elara slipped outside to their customary spot on the porch. The sun was setting in a blaze of color, and the evening air was finally cooling from the heat of the day. "This is what I always dreamed of," Elara said softly. "When I was young and the ranch was failing and Father was dying and I was so afraid. I dreamed of a day when there would be noise and laughter in this house again, when it would be full of family. You gave me that dream, Quinn." "We gave it to each other," Quinn said, pulling her close. "Every good thing in my life started the day I found you in that desert. You were the missing piece I did not even know I was looking for." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, comfortable in the silence that only comes from decades of partnership. Inside, they could hear the sounds of their family, the children's laughter, the low murmur of adult conversation. It was a symphony of normalcy and love, the reward for all the hard years and difficult choices. As the years continued to pass, Quinn and Elara grew older with grace and humor. They remained active on the ranch, though they left the heavy work to younger hands. They took pride in watching their grandchildren grow and learn, and in time there were great-grandchildren to spoil as well. On their 50th anniversary, the family threw another big celebration. This time there were even more people, as Matt's sons had married and started families of their own, and Sarah's children were grown with children of their own. The ranch house and yard were filled with 3 generations of Bryants, all of them there to honor the couple who had started it all. Elara stood beside Quinn, his arm around her waist as it had been for 5 decades, and looked out at the sea of faces. Every person there was connected to her and Quinn, connected to the choice she had made to survive in the desert and the choice he had made to stop and help. It was overwhelming and beautiful and more than she had ever imagined possible. "Thank you all for coming," she said when the crowd quieted down. "Quinn and I have been blessed beyond measure. We have had 50 years together, and every one of them has been a gift. We have built a life, a family, a legacy that will continue long after we are gone. And it all started with a broken arm and a cowboy who was kind enough to help. There was laughter and applause, and then Quinn spoke up. "I've told this story 100 times," he said, his voice still strong despite his years, "but I will tell it again because it never gets old. I found Elara walking across the desert with her arm broken and splinted with nothing but dead wood and cloth. She had set it herself rather than give up and die, and I knew right then that I was looking at the toughest, most remarkable person I would ever meet. I told her she was tougher than any man I had ever known, and I meant it. Still mean it today." He turned to look at Elara, and the love in his eyes made her heart swell. "You have been my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. You have made me a better man than I ever would have been without you. And I thank God every day that I happened to be riding across that particular stretch of desert at that particular moment." Elara felt tears streaming down her face, happy tears, grateful tears. She reached up to cup Quinn's weathered face in her hand. "And I thank God that you stopped," she said. "That you saw someone who needed help and you gave it freely. That you stayed when you could have left. That you loved me when I felt unlovable. You saved my life that day, Quinn Bryant, but more than that, you gave me a life worth saving." They kissed while the crowd cheered and applauded, and it felt like coming full circle. From that desperate moment in the desert to this celebration surrounded by family and love, the journey had been long and often difficult, but every step had been worth it. Quinn and Elara lived out their remaining years in contentment and peace. They watched their grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry on the work they had started, maintaining the ranch and building on its success. They spent their days in each other's company, still finding new things to talk about even after more than half a century together. When Quinn finally passed away at the age of 87, it was peacefully in his sleep with Elara beside him. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and then stopped, and she whispered words of love into the silence. Her heart was broken, but it was also full of gratitude for every moment they had shared. Elara lived 3 more years after Quinn's death, surrounded by family but feeling his absence every moment. She still went out to the barn every morning, still walked the land they had built together, still slept on his side of the bed because it smelled faintly of him. Her children and grandchildren worried about her, but she assured them she was fine. She had her memories, and they were enough. On a warm summer evening, sitting on the porch where she and Quinn had spent so many hours together, Elara felt a sudden pain in her chest. She knew immediately what it was, and oddly, she was not afraid. She looked out over the land one last time, at the golden light of sunset painting everything in shades of amber and rose, and she thought about the girl she had been, alone in the desert with a broken arm and no hope. That girl had saved herself through sheer force of will. She had done the impossible because the alternative was unacceptable. And in doing so, she had found not just survival but love and partnership, and a life richer than anything she could have imagined. As the pain intensified and her vision began to fade, Elara's last thought was of Quinn. She could almost see him, young and strong and smiling that crooked smile, riding toward her out of the heat shimmer just like he had 55 years ago. He was reaching down to help her up, to pull her onto his horse to take her home. "I am coming," she whispered, and then the darkness took her. The family buried Elara beside Quinn on a hill overlooking the ranch, in sight of the land they had loved and worked their whole lives. At the funeral, Matt spoke about his parents' legacy of love and determination. Sarah read from a poem about strength and courage. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared memories and tears. But the truest memorial was the ranch itself, still thriving, still producing, still bearing the mark of the couple who had built it from almost nothing. The land would continue, and with it, The story of the woman who set her own broken arm in the desert and the cowboy who loved her for her strength. It was a story that would be passed down through generations, growing into legend with each telling. The details might change over time, might be embellished or simplified, but the core truth would remain. Two people had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and through love and partnership and sheer stubborn determination, they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. The Pendleton Bryant Ranch continued to operate for decades more, run by Matt's sons and then their children. And every generation heard the story of how it all began, with a woman alone in the desert who refused to give up, and a man who stopped to help and ended up finding his home. It was a love story, but it was also a story about survival and strength, and the power of two people choosing to face the world together. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless, and to accept help when it is offered with an open heart. And on summer evenings, when the light turned golden and the heat finally began to ease, if you stood on the hill where Quinn and Elara were buried and looked out over the land they had loved, you could almost hear their voices on the wind. Laughing together, planning for the future, reminding each other that they were stronger together than they ever could have been apart. The legacy they left behind was not just land or cattle or even family, though all those things mattered. The true legacy was the example they set, the proof that love and determination could overcome almost any obstacle, that a woman could be strong and still be loved, that a man could admire strength rather than feel threatened by it. That partnership meant two people lifting each other up rather than one trying to control the other. It was a lesson their descendants carried forward, generation after generation, a gift as valuable as the land itself. And it all started on a blazing August day in 1878, when Elara Pendleton looked at her broken arm and decided to do the impossible, and Quinn Bryant rode out of the shimmering heat to find the woman who would become his whole world.